Now, hello everyone and welcome to Learn with the Lords question time. My name is Rebecca and I will be hosting today's event, which is part of our annual UK Parliament Week Festival 2020. I can see already that we're joined live by over 20 schools from right across the UK. So thank you all so much for joining us today and for submitting such fantastic questions for our panelists. So today's event is in two parts. We're going to be starting with a panel discussion during which our panelists will be discussing the role and effectiveness of select committees at scrutinising government. The discussion will reflect upon the real impact of select committee inquiries on government decision making. After this, I'm going to be putting your questions directly to our panelists, so make sure you listen out for your school's name. So on today's panel, we are thrilled to be joined by four members of the House of Lords. We're joined by Baroness Mackintosh of Hudnall. We are joined also by Baroness Finlay of Llandaff, Lord Patel and Lord Hayward. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Baroness Finlay to make the first point and start today's panel discussion.
I think the select committees in the House of Lords are somewhat invisible, but their reports are really respected around the world. And there are different types of committees. There are the standing committees, so there's things like science and technology that Lord Patel chairs. Then there are those that look at legislation that's going on in the background, so look at the regulations called statutory instruments, and will produce reports that brief the rest of the House on the details and the problems with these going through. And of course, with Brexit, lots of European committees. And then there are other special one-off committees. So one that I was involved in some years ago was on assisted dying, which seems to have hit the news again. And another one recently was about sexual abuse as a weapon of war. Very, very tough topic, really difficult to read. There's been one on housing and demographic change, i.e. the elderly population, the aging population, and so on. So the select committees have really taken things that are facing society and looked at those in great detail, take evidence, do visits, and I think go into topics in a degree of detail that I haven't seen anybody else do, because they really dig deep into the topic.
Okay, that's a fantastic first point, Baroness Finlay. Thank you. I can see Lord Hayward, you'd like to come in next. Perhaps you'd like to make your point.
Yes, I was going to talk about the general impact of Parliament, both the Lords and the Commons, and particularly in relation to select committees. But I think we're in a very odd period for Parliament and have been really for the last 4 years. Parliament in both houses has been dominated by, first of all, Brexit, and then by coronavirus. And that may run for another few months yet with both. And therefore, looking at the select committees, they do incredibly valuable work. But as I say, unfortunately, given the circumstances of the nation, of the world in many ways, the work of the select committees has got somewhat hidden. It's still valuable, and it is likely that they will come back to be seriously influential after this period of 4 or 5 years is complete.
All right, thank you very much, Lord Hayward. Would Baroness Mackintosh or Lord Patel like to come in at this point?
Yes.
Oh, should we start with Baroness Mackintosh and then move to Lord Patel? Oh no, Lord Patel first. Lord Patel it is.
Thank you very much. I can comment on the comment was already made about Science and Technology Committee, which I happen to chair just now, although I've been involved before in other select committees. The Science and Technology Committee looks at issues that might be developing in science, or there is a need to involve the science in policy making. So for instance, just now, we've been looking for weeks now at the science behind the pandemic. And what does the science tell us as the pandemic evolves? Because remember, this is a new virus. We knew nothing. This virus, apart from its existence before it came to humans. The other inquiry we're doing is the science of aging, which, because the government has set themselves a challenge that by 2035, healthy aging will be increased by 5 years, but there is no science basis to it. And the science of the process of aging, which I'm unfortunately for you 400 guys, youngsters watching, I have to tell you, you will age one day. The science of aging is quite important for you as well as for me. That's all I'll say just now, but I'll talk about science, technology, and other inquiries later.
Oh, thank you, Lord Patel, for sharing your personal experience of committees. That's great. Baroness McIntosh, would you like to come in next?
Yes, I think it comes quite naturally out of what Lord Patel just said. It's really about the difference between experience and expertise to participation in select committees. So I have to say I've done a lot of select committee work over the years, and I have rarely, if ever, been the expert on the committee. All three of my colleagues around the table today, around the virtual table today, are experts in fields which are often the subject of various kinds of select committee inquiry. My participation has often been as somebody who doesn't have that kind of direct expertise to bring, but has broader experience. My background is actually in the arts, but just to give you some examples, my very first select committee was on stem cell research. Now, that was a very long time ago, but I am not a scientist. I didn't have any expertise, but what we were looking at was the moral implications of stem cell research. So it needed a broad base of experience and view to address that particular issue. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, lest we forget, is that one of the other aspects of select committee work is pre-legislative scrutiny and post-legislative scrutiny of upcoming legislation. Now, in my view, there's not enough of that done, but it does get done. And it means that, for example, 2 examples of mine, I worked on what was then called the Draft Mental Incapacity Act, which became the Mental Capacity Act, which Lady Finlay was also part of. That was a really good piece of legislation, which has had a huge impact, albeit it's had to be modified over the years. I also worked on the draft mental health bill at a similar time, which got, frankly, completely slaughtered by pre-legislative scrutiny and was withdrawn. And it just shows you the impact of different kinds of impact that select committee work can have.
Oh, thank you so much. So students watching, pre-legislative scrutiny is perhaps something that you can look a little bit further into, because it sounds like that's a really good part of this debate about the effectiveness of select committees. I saw Baroness Finlay, you popped your hand up as Baroness McIntosh was speaking. Would you like to come in next?
I did, because actually the Mental Capacity Act and the Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee was incredibly important, because what it did was 10 years on, it said, this act isn't being used properly. So we have this fabulous piece of legislation that should have really helped people with learning difficulties, with dementia, with after a head injury and everything. But then it wasn't being rolled out adequately. So following that, there was a decision that somebody had to lead it, and I applied for that, and currently I chair what's now called the National Mental Capacity Forum, and so it's gone full circle and landed on my shoulders. I've got to do something about it. So next week I've got a webinar we've got it at Capacity 500 from all over the UK, and this is the 5th one we've done about implementing the Mental Capacity Act during lockdown, and how we do it, and how we protect people who've got learning difficulties, and how we improve their care. So the influence going way back from that select committee, we're now 6 years on, I think, from when that committee sat, and we are finally bringing about some of the changes that committee said had to happen. And it's that slow burn, I think. Sometimes people think the committee report things will change instantly. No, they don't. The detail of their recommendations means it's a slow process, but the change can happen.
Thank you, Baroness Finlay. I think that's a great point for all the students watching, that perhaps one of the key arguments here is select committees might not lead to immediate change, but can do in the future. Can I ask everybody that's watching to just mute their microphones for me, because I can hear a little bit of what sounds like a phone conversation happening. So if people could do that for me, that would be lovely. I will hand over now to Lord Hayward, please.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on Baroness McIntosh's point, which Baroness Finlay has already referred to as well. And this is pre-legislative and post-legislative scrutiny. I think Baroness McIntosh does undersell herself. She has an expertise as well as experience, and she made the point that she served on committees because of her experience rather than expertise. I came to the House of Lords rather sadly as one of the experts on opinion polling, election statistics, electoral law, and all that sort of field. So therefore, I think the students can imagine what I've been spending the last few days and many doing. But the first select committee that I was put on was reviewing opinion polling, which may now be current in light of events in the United States. But the second one was also on electoral matters, which was to review 5 years after the Electoral Registration and Administration Act passed in 2013, and we in the House of Lords were asked to look at it, and we've just completed our report and it's gone to government, and government has made a response, and we will be debating it at some stage or another. Having completed that, the other obsession I have in my life is sport, and have been moved from elections to a sports committee now. I think that the point about all these committees is that, unlike the Commons, and I was going to touch on it in my specific question later, but I'll pick it up now, that whereas the Commons are departmental select committees, we tend to look at cross-cutting major issues as they affect society in general. And I think that is where the strength of our system actually is very much in that field, either of looking at existing legislation or at looking at broad issues in one form or another and preparing reports on that basis.
Thank you, Lord Hayward. So would you say that, as well as obviously having standing committees in the House of Lords, having committees that are linked to the important issues of the day that don't necessarily last very long is also very helpful?
I think it's extremely helpful, and it's something that we do in the Lords far better than they do in the Commons, partly because you've got this experience and partly because you've got expertise. It's a very risky member of the House of Lords who speaks on a subject about which they are not an expert, because the chances are that there are national experts in the Lords and probably international experts on the subjects, and they can be brought together, but it is an aspect of the work that the Lords does well.
Thank you very much. Baroness McIntosh, I can see you've got your hand up. Is that in reference to something Baroness Finlay or Lord Hayward have said?
It is indeed. I just wanted to make the point, because it probably will come up later, but one of the things that Baroness Finlay's description of her experience with the Mental Capacity Act demonstrates is the value of continuity, which is very difficult to achieve under the Commons system for good reasons, because they are an elected house. But what you would not get necessarily in the Commons, you might get it, but you couldn't really be sure you would, is that continuing engagement from somebody like Lady Finlay, with all her experience and expertise in the field, for example, of mental capacity, going all the way through from pre-leg, through post-leg, and on into implementation. And I was able to stick with her through pre and post, but of course I can't then carry it through, but she can. And it's one of the reasons why I think that the arguments around the nature of the House of Lords, how people become members and how long they remain members, which are very contentious, do have to be balanced by the recognition that there is great value in continuity in some circumstances. And I think the select committees are a good example of that.
Thank you, Baroness McIntosh. So for students watching, I think that's a really good point in favour of not only select committees, but also, as Baroness McIntosh said, membership of the House of Lords as well, that continuity. Lord Patel, we haven't heard from you for a while. Would you like to come in and make a point? You're on mute, sir, if you just unmute yourself.
your instruction, Rebecca.
There we go.
No, I was waiting for students to ask me the questions.
Oh, that'll be in about 10 minutes. So we're just sticking to the discussion for the moment.
Okay, so if I go back to not so much the House of Lords and the expertise, the one thing I would say about House of Lords is maybe people don't widely understand outside, is that there are lots of people with a different backgrounds who've developed their experience and expertise through either the jobs they've done throughout their life, or they have had a great deal of experience in different aspects of government and policy making that they better understand. For instance, I might say one thing about science, as is quite obvious now with the pandemic. The scientists say what the science says, but that doesn't mean that that can be easily be converted into political policy making. That's only the politicians or government who better understand the wider issues about doing X, Y, Z might have. So the expertise of previous cabinet ministers, we don't have a previous prime minister just now, but we used to, but lots of previous cabinet ministers and lots of other expertise from the various backgrounds. Sorry, I'm getting
I think if everyone could just mute their mic that isn't Lord Patel, I think that would probably help with this feedback.
Otherwise, I'll put the earphones, see if that helps.
There we go.
So if I go back to how science-related issue that I've been involved in most of the time in the Lords can affect. So let me say one for instance, which is quite, which is about genomics, for instance. That it was the Science and Select Committee that first identified after the human genome was sequenced. And for those of you who do not remember the date, it was April the 14th, 2003, the human genome. It was announced that the full human genome was completed in the sequence. That it was important that UK was a leader in establishing, because we had been with our Sanger Center in Cambridge, in genomics. And the government picked it up. And we established one of the most leading countries in establishing genomic data banks, etc., which now identifies diseases. And we were the first one, therefore, to be able to sequence the virus, the coronavirus, when we came. The Chinese did it first, and then we did it further. And it's still being sequenced now. And to give you an example, for instance, how it will benefit, we can sequence the virus and it's mutated again in the second wave, but not become more virulent. So its ability to infect remains the same, although it's mutated. But we now can learn about those humans who were infected to see what difference was in their genome that made some people sicker than others. Mm-hmm. So the Science and Technology Committee, when they explore the science, which we did just now, but still doing it, related to pandemic, and we did it previously in the genomic report that established the UK's lead in the 100,000 human genome and genome bank we have, and various other banks that we developed. So but people may not understand how much of an influence, apart from legislation related to everyday life, which is important, that Lord Select Committees have. I have to say, with all due respect to the Common Select Committee, because they operate in a different way, they cannot look at the in-depth science behind any of the new science technology. That applies to physical science too. We recently did an inquiry on off-site construction.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Lord Patel. Just wanted to say thank you so much for providing a really good, tangible example for the students that are watching of a success of a select committee. That's definitely something to take note of. I think we'll come now to Baroness Finlay, and I think we'll make this the final point in the discussion so we can leave as much time as possible for your questions for all of you watching. So, Baroness Finlay, over to you.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on the point made by Baroness McIntosh over expertise, because actually, although you might think that you know a lot about your subject, nobody knows everything. And I found when I've been on a select committee or chaired one, that I've learnt a huge amount. So I was on a housing select committee, and I wanted to go on because I've been a hospice doctor all my life nearly, and was well aware of the problems of looking after people in poor housing. I learnt huge amounts on that, and then was able to bring in the evidence too about how poor housing is a social determinant of health in the long term, how people need green spaces, places to exercise, fresh air, the dangers of carbon monoxide in the home if people haven't got an alarm and they've got gas central heating and it's dangerous, and the importance of having places that you can get a wheelchair into, not with doorways that are so narrow that people with disability can't visit. So that was really quite lateral to my expertise, which has been around care of the dying. That's been much, much broader. But I learned a huge amount on that committee, and I learned all about planning from the people who knew about planning and architecture and building techniques. And the tragedy of Grenfell Tower and the fire now, having been on that committee, I feel that I have a duty to be involved in trying to improve the situation for everybody still in poor housing. So again, that's motivated me to take things forward in legislation.
Thank you very much, Baroness Finlay, and thank you to all of you for those fantastic insights about select committees. We're going to move on now to all of your questions for all of you watching. So Lord Hayward, we're going to start with a few questions for you that a bit of a comparison between Commons and Lords select committees. And the first one is, based on your experiences in both houses, what are the main differences between select committees in the House of Lords and the House of Commons? And are recommendations considered in a similar way? Now, that's a question from St Edward's School in Poole. So thank you for watching. Lord Hayward, over to you. Oh, you're on mute, Lord Hayward. Don't worry, easily done.
Sorry, there are a number of differences, and in fact we've touched on one or two of them already, but if I come back over them, one, we are generally cross-cutting as against specifically departmental, which the Commons operates to. So we can be convened on special subjects, and I touched on this question of opinion polling and the errors of opinion polls and whether they affect the way people vote, and that was my first select committee that I served on. So we can be convened in a different way. There isn't elections to chairmanships, which the Commons have, and we may well come back to that. The groups are allocated specific numbers, and again, in the Commons, there isn't a concentration necessarily specifically on expertise, although I agree strongly with what Baroness McIntosh said about experience. You are more likely, as Baroness Finlay indicated just now in her last answer, to get more experts on the committee in the Lords than you will in the Commons. And in terms of how they're dealt with, in the Lords, we get a debate at some stage. Now, they may be long on because of things like Brexit or coronavirus. That's not guaranteed in the Commons. Both the Commons and the Lords will get replies from government departments, but we get the opportunity to debate them if it is so deemed to be necessary in a way that you don't in the Commons.
Thank you very much, Lord Hayward. I think we'll pause your next question because I think we might be joined by Lord Delakia in a moment. I think he's having a few issues getting into the meeting. So we're going to move on to Lord Patel this time. And Lord Patel, we've had a really good question here from the John Roan School in London, and they want to know how the work of select committees has been affected by the need to work from home / social distancing, and has this had a positive or a negative effect on their scrutiny function? We can't actually see you at the moment, Lord Patel. Would you mind turning your camera on for us? There we go. Hello. Oh, we've gone again. Oh, and you're back. There we go.
Sorry, my machine's playing up probably.
That's all right.
Well, first of all, as far as the working of the committee is concerned, it hasn't had much of an effect. We had to learn different ways, particularly as chairman. I had to learn different ways as to how to manage democracy of the committee, because it's quite a big committee, and at the same time, not allow one person to speak all the time. is that much easier when you round what we call a horseshoe, which is the shape of the table that we normally have in a committee room. So in terms of working remote, it hasn't affected that much the work, because we change the way we work and make sure that the work still continues. So that was the main question. What was the secondary question?
It was, has working from home or social distancing within committees had a positive or a negative impact on their scrutiny function? I think that was the main bit of the question.
Well, usually I'm social distance from the rest of them by about 400 miles. So on the Teams or Zoom. So that hasn't affected, because we do not meet physically. We meet only virtually.
All right, thank you very much for that. I think we'll come next to Baroness McIntosh, and this is a question from Athena College in Norfolk. So thank you very much for your question. And this question is, should select committees be given the power to subpoena witnesses?
Well, I'm sure the question has been asked because it's a matter of current debate in the House of Commons. I think they're currently examining whether their select committee should be given that power. If I'm wrong about that, somebody will no doubt correct me, but I imagine that's why it's come up. So I think what I would say in answer is that in a way, those powers already exist. They're not called powers to subpoena, but there is a thing called Contempt of Parliament. And under that heading, it is possible for both the Lords and the Commons to require witnesses to come and give evidence. But in order to do so, you have to use some quite underused powers, let's put it like that. I'm just going to read you, because it's quite short, exactly what it says. A refusal by a witness to attend a select committee may be construed as contempt. That's worth following up for those of you who don't know about Contempt of Parliament. And if a witness is unwilling to attend, the committee can agree to order the attendance of the witness at a specified date and time. The way that gets done is that the order is signed by the chairman and then it's sent by registered post, or, and this is where it can get quite tricky, served personally by a member of the Sergeant at Arms office. And in the House of Lords, that would be a member of Black Rod's office, or indeed Black Rod herself. The House, in this case, the House of Commons I'm reading from, may order the Sergeant at Arms as warrant officer of the House to serve a warrant on the witness. And the last use of a warrant to summon witnesses was in January 1992, when the Maxwell brothers were reluctant to attend the Social Security Select Committee inquiry into the operation of pension funds. There's a little bit of history for you. I will just say that my own experience is that once, only once, on a committee that I was serving on at the time, then called the Communications Committee, we did have a refusal from a witness, the two witnesses, in fact, who were joint owners of a rather large media group, who did not want to come and give us evidence. And the chairman of the committee at that time, who was Lord Fowler, who is now the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords, thought very seriously about sending Black Rod around to knock on their door. In the event, he didn't, and they didn't come. But I think the answer to your question, which is a good and interesting one, is maybe the powers already exist. Maybe the Commons will decide they need to take new powers, but use them very, very carefully and infrequently.
Thank you very much, Baroness McIntosh, for that fantastic answer. Before we come to Lord Hayward, I just want to say a huge welcome to Lord Dallachia, who's been able to join us. Hello, sir. We can't see you at the moment, so if you wouldn't mind turning your camera on, that would be great. We're going to go to Lord Hayward, and then I'll come to you for the next student question, if that's okay. Lord Hayward, so would you like to come in and comment on what Baroness McIntosh was speaking about?
Yes, just following on from Baroness McIntosh's comment, one of the reasons it's being looked at in the Commons is because of a certain gentleman called Dominic Cummings, the aide to the Prime Minister, who was asked on 2 successive occasions to appear before a committee, not a select committee. And he didn't appear, he refused to appear, and was first of all found to be in contempt of the committee, and then ultimately on a vote on the vote of the whole House that he was found to be in contempt. But they discovered they'd got no powers to take action against him. And in fact, I wrote to the Speaker of both Houses, the Commons and the Lords, asking why Dominic Cummings had got a parliamentary pass when he'd been found to be in contempt of Parliament, both houses. And that is the reason why, because, and I've had discussions with the committee, because they realised they really couldn't take action, even against somebody who was required to have access to the Houses of Parliament.
Thank you very much, Lord Hayward. So Lord Delacchia, will come to you next. I do hope you can hear us. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you very well, thank you.
Oh, brilliant. We can't yet see you at the moment, sir. It might just be me, but have you got your camera switched on?
I've got it switched on, but I don't know.
Oh, there we are. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Can I first of all apologize for being rude joining you at this time? I've been trying since 10 to 11.
I'm so sorry about that, sir.
On and off about what's going on, but I apologize for not having heard most of the discussion so far.
No problem at all. Technology, there's always something that goes wrong, but thank you so much for joining us. We're really pleased to have you here. So your question is from Solihull Sixth Form College, and it's another question similar to one that Lord Hayward answered about comparisons between Commons and Lords committees.
Yes.
So the first part of the question is, has the election of committee chairs in the House of Commons had a positive impact on the effectiveness of committee scrutiny? And then perhaps you could tell us how House of Lords committee chairs are chosen.
Yes, in relation to Commons, I think it's very clear. Since it was set up in 1979, there was very much the arrangement between whips and the political parties as to who should chair what. Since then, in 2010, there's been a change. It's the entire members of Parliament in the Commons who elect the chair of the committee, and ultimately it is chosen by the appropriate committee supervising that particular area of work. It has improved the distribution of chairmanship among different committees. That I think is a good thing. And the second thing is it's much more effective in that particular way. It's more democratic than simply a few people choosing a chair of a particular committee. In the Lords, it's different. It's not coming to that democratic process. But I think there is a consultation taking place between different whips and the chairman of the committees to be able to find out who is the most appropriate person and accordingly making distribution on that particular basis. That's what I've seen so far. But it's effective in the sense that once you are appointed a chairman or a member of a committee, you go beyond party politics and you are very much independent in your particular thought. It's not what your political allegiance is, but how you can exercise independent judgment on the work of the committee, which is one of the most important. And in any committee that I've served so far, I've been very, very impressed with the quality of the chairman that have been there.
Thank you very much, Lord Delacchia. That was a fantastic answer. We're going to move now to a question from Cranford House School in Oxford. So thank you for joining us. And this is a question for Baroness Finlay. And it's a really interesting one, this. Has the televising of select committees added value to the process?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it has enormously, because you must remember that 80% of communication is non-verbal, 20% is verbal. So if you have something transcribed and you just read the words, you're missing a huge amount. When you see somebody, you see them wince, you see the way they're uncomfortable in the chair, you realise they're squirming. They're really finding this a difficult question to answer. I personally would also like us to be able to film sometimes on visits. I chaired a select committee on allergy, and we went to schools and we went to different places where allergy testing was going on. Now, to fast forward, we became terribly aware that you must have spare EpiPens in schools for children who get anaphylactic reactions suddenly. But I think if we could have filmed a visit, just showing the chaos in a school dining room that can potentially happen if a child has an anaphylactic reaction and they've left their EpiPen at home or whatever, we would have got the change to allow schools to have extra EpiPens. We would have got it through years earlier. It's finally happened. So I think the visual complements the words enormously.
Thank you very much for that answer. I do hope that helped. So thank you very much for that. We're going to move on now to some questions more about scrutiny generally. And I'm going to come first to Lord Dallachia so we can hear from you a little bit more. And your question is from Stourport High School. So thank you so much for watching, guys. And the question is, would the House of Lords be more effective in scrutinising the government if it was completely apolitical?
I think the system seems to work very well. We've got to accept that in a democracy, we are electing our members of parliament. Many of us do so politically. Some of them would never want to declare their political allegiance of which political party they belong to. But the most important thing is, it's not what politics you are about, but the judgment that you exercise in reaching a particular decision, in scrutinizing the issues in front of you. And I have come across almost all members that I've worked with are maybe political, but they exercise their particular judgment. To me, that is one of the most important things in Parliament. And to me, people have gone across the political boundaries whenever you're scrutinizing either the policies or the witnesses. You are able to talk to people across political structure, and that is a very important aspect of select committees.
Oh, thank you very much, Lord Dallachia. And we're going to move now to Lord Haywood to ask you to draw again on your experience in the House of Commons. And your question is from the Royal Grammar School in High Wycombe. And it's, does the Liaison Committee provide effective scrutiny of the Prime Minister?
Can I say that before I start on my answer, that I have sad memories of Royal Grammar School, High Wycombe, in that I ran for my own school, which was then Maidenhead Grammar School, and we competed against RGS, and they have some horrendous hills up which I was required to run as part of the cross-country team. So I just make that as an observation, as an aside. The Liaison Committee has come into operation since I left the Commons. It seemed a good idea, but the problem is that it is just too big. There are too many committee chairs and around the table. They've therefore tried to set about restricting them and having smaller sessions where you choose the limited number of people who question the Prime Minister. I think it makes good television, but I'm not sure that it adds that much to the greater knowledge of politicians and the public at large. You have the opportunity to cross-examine a Prime Minister at Prime Minister's question time. You have ministers who will give more detailed knowledge. So although I think it was an interesting idea, and I don't know whether my colleagues share that view, but I think it doesn't work as well as it might in theory.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting perspective for the students that are watching, so thank you. Baroness McIntosh, we're going to come to you next with a question that was asked both by Oban High School and Archbishop Holgate School in York. And that question is, which, in your opinion, is the most effective method of holding the government to account of all the different forms of scrutiny that take place in the UK Parliament?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that all the various methods have their own virtues. And we've just been talking about the particular merits of the select committee system, which obviously operates over a long period of time, looks in great detail, develops options, advises government on the various ways in which things could be different, and sometimes, as Lady Finlay pointed out earlier, can produce effects over a really substantial period of time. So that's one kind of scrutiny. But I think that the two things that I would draw attention to sort of in the here and now are that, firstly, there is the question of, as it were, putting the screws on ministers in public in real time, which is what the work in the chambers of both houses is about. If you're standing at the dispatch box as a minister, and somebody is really pinning you down with a question to which you don't have a tremendously good answer, which, let's face it, does happen from time to time, There is a very obvious sense in which the scrutiny is being conducted right there, right then. And that, of course, is what most people notice because it happens on television and particularly at moments like PMQs in the House of Commons. But I think there's another kind of scrutiny which is frankly almost never talked about, which is that the collaboration that goes on behind the scenes across party, often between government and opposition. When an issue has come up, it's been discussed and debated sometimes in the chamber in a kind of public way, as I've just described, but then it has to be resolved. And a lot of it is done by collaboration, discussion, and agreement. And what we're left with is the stuff that can't be resolved in that way, which then becomes back into the public realm, voted on and disputed. Excuse me.
Bless you.
So I think, thank you. So I think that it's very important to remember that scrutiny happens in a very large number of different ways. There's one thing that I think we're missing at the moment as a direct result of the pandemic and how we operate, which is spontaneous intervention, which is also a very good way of helping to intensify scrutiny. If you can get up in the middle of a discussion or a debate and ask a minister to give a more detailed or amplified answer than the one he or she has just been trying to get away with, to put it bluntly, it's very effective, and we can't do that at the moment because we're not allowed.
Thank you very much, Baroness McIntosh. So we've reached our final 2 questions for today because we've only got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to come to Baroness Finlay first. And this is a question again from Royal Grammar School in High Wycombe, which Lord Hayward has very painful memories of. And that question is, can individual backbenchers make a difference in Parliament?
Yeah, I would have to say yes, definitely. Let me give you one example I'm really proud of: smoking in public places. I was getting frustrated, it wasn't happening. I wrote a private member's bill. My private member's bill didn't get anywhere, but it then got picked up by the government of the day. And look, we don't have smoking in public places. And I'm really proud of that. More recently, I've been trying to do something about pesticides and contamination of food with pesticide residues. We've put down amendments, we're keeping on going. And the other thing that a group of us as backbenchers are doing is something about human rights of the Uyghur population in China, who seem to be really having very severe infringements of their human rights and the terrible problems of organ harvesting from prisoners and so on. So yes, individual backbenchers can, and I think sometimes we tackle things just as we've done on human rights in China that no government of the day quite wants to go near, but we can bring the.
Thank you, Baroness Finlay. 2 great examples for all of you watching to include in your essays, etc. Lord Patel, we're going to finish with a question for you, and that's from Stourport High School. And that question is a very relevant one for everything that's going on at the moment. So as the chair of the Science of COVID-19 Committee, could you tell us what recommendations your committee have made or will make to the government, and then how else the House of Lords is scrutinising the government on this issue?
I take the last question first. The House of Lords scrutinizes the government in relation to the pandemic on a weekly, if not on a daily basis, because every day there's a different legislation introduced at different parts of the country which require scrutiny from the Parliament, and both houses do it, and we do it in the Lords on a daily basis. We also have at times, like we did on Wednesday, a long debate because of the lockdown that is now operating from yesterday, a long debate about the government plans and what the basis of that was and how it will affect. In terms of the committee and how it does that and what recommendations we have, first of all, we explored the science behind it, not just about the virus, to understand whether it's likely to get more virulent and therefore worse in terms of affecting the population and disease. Second, to explore how we might find and what were the methodologies used to identify drugs that will reduce death rate and severity of the disease. And the United Kingdom has led the world in that respect because of the mechanism that was set up to identify drugs that already exist that could be effective. And one good example of that is the dexamethasone, which has reduced death rate by nearly 30% in people who are dying in April who will not die now by about a third. Also exploring different drugs and vaccines. So it is likely that we in the United Kingdom will lead the world in the first vaccine if it happens to be, and people are optimistic about it. The third issue is to look long term and to look at whether the surveillance mechanism for impending infections in the world works well or not. And clearly, we might say to a degree it did work. On the other hand, you might say it did not, because we should have been able to contain or even stop this pandemic happening before it happened. Which certainly we should have been able to contain it better than it did. It exploded worldwide and is still exploding. The third issue was when the first lockdown was over, we explored when the virus transmission rate was very low, if you remember, in early August and September. We looked at the science behind it to see how we can keep it controlled, and it did. I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister on behalf of the committee with 5 key points that will stop the likelihood of second wave coming. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It might not happen because of political reasons. It might not have happened because of logistic reasons, whatever. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the Prime Minister or the government did not want to do it. But because it didn't happen, we have a second wave. And we will learn from the second wave and see what happens with the second lockdown to understand the science. The important thing is just now to reduce the transmission of the virus.
Thank you very much, Lord Patel. That was a really thorough answer. So thank you so much for that. I really hope Stourport High School that touched on the things you wanted to know. We're going to have to finish there. So thank you all so much for joining us from all across the UK. I want to make a special mention to Eastbury Community School, Channing School and Arthur Terry School, because unfortunately we didn't get onto your questions about parliamentary reform, but I do think we touched on quite a lot of it in the discussion at the beginning. So hopefully that was helpful. I want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today and for providing such excellent insights for our students, especially because this is UK Parliament Week, obviously a very exciting week for all of us. So thank you so much, and do just keep an eye on our Twitter account and on our website for more events that come up for students aged 16 to 18. So schools that are in the call, I will let you leave the call first because we're going to hang around just for a little while if everybody has time. Thank you so much again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon in another event. So bye-bye.